A scientist named Joseph Henry, his friend Leonard Gale, and a machinist inventor named Alfred Vail invented the telegraph that transformed our world. Samuel Morse just put their ideas together and gained the fame and profit. But he didn't do it for money, however. His inspirations were a strange brew of ego, tragedy, and xenophobia. How can ego, tragedy, and xenophobia lead to Samuel Morse gaining all the fame for this invention? Well, I'll tell you in the video. Ready? Let's go.
Electricity, 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 electricity.
Samuel Finley Breeze Morse was born in 1791 to an upper-class family in Charleston, Massachusetts, and he had two unconnected passions, painting and xenophobia, both of which, in a roundabout way, led him to his interest in the electric telegraph. Let's start with painting. When Morse was 19, he traveled to Europe to study painting. Well, not really study as much as pontificate on his genius. He wrote his mother it wasn't enough to be a great portrait painter. No, he wanted to, quote, revive the splendor of the 15th century, to rival the genius of Raphael, a Michelangelo, or a Titan. Morse then spent the next 15 years in England and America as a successful painter of portraits. This is when tragedy struck. In 1825, Morse got a commission to travel to paint a portrait of the American Revolutionary hero, Lafayette. While working on the portrait, Morse received the news by mail that his young wife had fallen ill. Although he immediately traveled to see her, it was too late and she had already passed away. This tragedy was Morse's first stimulus towards finding a faster way to communicate. Meanwhile, Morse worked on his other great passion, a virulent hatred of Catholics and Catholic immigrants, writing pamphlets, giving speeches, and unsuccessfully running for mayor against this, quote, cloven foot of foreign heresy. Morse decided that what was needed was for Protestants to have a way to communicate quickly to help them thwart this menace. In 1832, on a boat ride from England, Morse was talking to another passenger about electromagnets and was inspired to think of a system where the electricity moves something electromagnetically as a signal. Morse didn't know that he wasn't the first to have this idea. In fact, it seemed like anyone who'd heard of an electromagnet thought of a telegraph. The electromagnet had been invented 7 years earlier when an Englishman named William Surgeon determined if you wrapped a wire around an iron bar, the bar would act like a magnet when the electricity flowed in the wire. But when the electricity was cut, the bar basically stopped being a magnet and would no longer create magnetic attraction. This seemed like an obvious method of sending signals long distance. However, Sturgeon's electromagnet was wrapped too loosely to make a telegraph. It would only transmit signals up to about 200 feet. Just before Morse went on that boat ride, an American scientist named Joseph Henry found that if you insulated the wire and wrapped it very tightly around the iron, you could create an incredibly powerful electromagnet. He used it to lift over 2,000 pounds. He also made a smaller electromagnet that he powered with a battery over a mile away. Henry wrote that his invention would be, quote, directly applicable to forming an electromagnetic telegraph. Now, Morse didn't know any of this because he didn't think of doing any research. He also had no scientific background. Still, Henry's research did end up helping Morse eventually and significantly. See, 3 years later, Morse got a job as a professor of art at New York University, started to work on his telegraph idea on the side, but with no success. Morse then contacted a local science teacher named Leonard Gale. Gale was a friend of Henry's and proceeded to teach Morse how to make an effective electromagnet from his understanding of Henry's work. Morse still had one major hurdle to his discovery. The problem with the telegraph is if you made the wires too long, the wires themselves had too much resistance and the current in the coil would be too small to register on the other end. What you needed was an electric switch which would start a new circuit with a new battery. In 1837, Morse once again turned to Leonard Gale, who thought of Henry's experiments. 2 years earlier, Henry had made a spectacular demonstration with two of his discoveries. So a long-distance signal powered a small electromagnet that closed the switch that powered a new battery with a strong electromagnet. Gale realized that Henry had already made an electromagnetic switch and made a version of it for Morse for his telegraph. Morse felt that he had a working model and filed for a patent. He also attracted the attention of a mechanic named Alfred Vail. Vail started to work for Morse for a percent of the future profits. but where all related patents would be, quote, taken out in the name and for the exclusive benefit of Morse. Vail then invented a telegraph key that worked like a stapler. Where you pressed it, it closed the circuit to a battery, and when you let go, the circuit was broken. Vail also set up the receiver with spinning paper and coils that would punch a mark in the paper. If you tapped the key for a second, the paper would get a dot. If you held down the key, it would leave a long bar or dash. Therefore, Vail made a code where each letter was a combination of dots and dashes. This is commonly called Morse code. Meanwhile, Joseph Henry wrote that he was disgusted to learn of the charlatanism from Professor Morse, who's claimed the entire origin of the project. Henry didn't want to profit off the telegraph, but he sure wanted the acknowledgement. Then in 1839, Leonard Gale went on vacation. Not knowing Henry's irritation with him, Morse sent Henry a letter asking for advice for his telegraph, quote, as a learner, with no contribution to your stock of experiments of any value. Henry was charmed. He agreed to meet in May of 1839 and helped Morse with his work, specifically on how to improve how long a signal could travel. Meanwhile, Morse tried to get government funding. He talked to Francis Smith, a congressman from Maine, and the chairman of the House Commerce Committee. Morse and Smith decided that if the government funded Morse's company, Smith could get a portion of the company. With the help of a friendly letter from Joseph Henry, Smith wrote a bill to give, basically, himself and Morse $30,000, equivalent to $1 million today, to build a telegraph line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. On May 24th, 1844, Morse and D.C. signaled to Vail and Baltimore, "What hath God wrought?" Soon Morse's telegraph was taking over the country. However, Morse was soon embroiled in lawsuit after lawsuit, as many people tried to profit off his invention. Joseph Henry was forced to participate in some of these trials and said under oath that he was, quote, not aware that Mr. Morse ever made a single original discovery applicable to the invention of the telegraph. Incensed, Morse wrote a book where he loudly complained that Henry did nothing and he was the originator of all things to do with the telegraph. After that, Morse tried to erase all of Henry's accomplishments and most of Alfred Vail's accomplishments as well. Meanwhile, Alfred Vail did not complain, as he felt his contract with Morse meant that his ideas were basically Morse property. He couldn't patent anything anyway, and Morse had come up with the original idea. He was also friends with Morse and felt their friendship was important, as was, quote, the peaceful unity of the invention. Vail worked on telegraphs for 4 more years, but felt he was not appreciated and quit, writing Morse that, quote, I have made up my mind to leave the telegraph to take care of itself, since it cannot take care of me. He died 10 years later, nearly destitute. On the other hand, despite all the lawsuits, Morse retired with a ridiculous amount of money. He then spent his free time arguing, as a Northerner, for the joys of slavery, describing the master-slave relationship as, quote, the most beautiful example of domestic happiness and contentment that this fallen world knows. Ironically, the telegraph increased long-distance communication, which increased the influx of immigrants and helped the abolitionists let people know about the horrors of slavery. Meanwhile, Joseph Henry became the first president of the Smithsonian Institute and was known as America's premier scientist. Politically, he was the opposite of Morse, strongly anti-slavery and a personal friend of Lincoln. Henry didn't like to talk about Morse and the telegraph much, but he did once say, quote, if I could live my life again, I might have taken out more patents. The telegraph was transformative, but what really brought electricity into our lives to light up our homes was finding a way to generate electricity from motion instead of just from the chemicals in a battery. This, too, in a way, began with a discovery by Joseph Henry way back in 1830 or so. See, when Henry was first playing with coils of electromagnets, he noticed something strange. When one coil was connected to a battery, a completely separate coil would get a jolt of current. He had discovered induction. Henry took some time to publish, as he was busy teaching, and months later, Henry's English doppelganger, Michael Faraday, independently discovered the same thing. Faraday then took it to the next level and used his discovery to create the first generator and to create the idea of magnetic fields. And that story is next time on The Secret History of Electricity.
Electricity, electricity, electricity.